Vincent, we will now move to the panel, and the moderator there can then pick up some of the questions that are coming in.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Morning, good evening, wherever you are following this event. Let me first congratulate Zia and Chauncey for putting together an excellent volume on probably the most important challenges of our times, covering technological change in different segments of our economies and thinking the roles of policies to play to translate these technological changes into better growth and equity outcomes. The book offers a loaded agenda, however you look at it. When I was reading the book, I was thinking this is all about, of course, future growth, and to some extent, whether the 2020s could be the roaring 20s. As some of you know, there is this idea that you can look back to the 1918 Spanish flu and hope for a decade of rapid global growth after this COVID-19 pandemic, reminiscent of these roaring 20s of that era. What happened during that period is that building on technological breakthroughs in earlier decades, North America and Europe enjoyed rapid modernization and strong economic growth in the 1920s. Automobiles replaced horse-drawn transportation, and they became widely utilized as improvements in assembly lines cut costs. Newly built electrical grids paved the way for rapid industrial and household electrification. The economies of the United States, Japan, and some European countries became more productive. Global growth that averaged 3.6% in the 1920s was double that of the preceding 2 decades. So now we have been witnessing rapid technological change, so maybe we are on the verge of another roaring 20s if we follow the prescriptions this book presents. I will get back to this issue later in the session. We have an excellent panel to talk about a wide range of issues covering technology, productivity, industry, and finance in light of the insights from the book. Let me briefly introduce our panelists. Sang-Hoon Chung is a research fellow in the Department of Economic Policy and Strategy in KBI. Chiara Criscuola, Head of Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship Division in the OECD. Thomas Philippon, Max Hein Professor of Finance at Stern School of Business at New York University. And Martin Kaufman is Assistant Director in the IMF. The game plan is very clear in the panel. I will ask the panelists 2 rounds of questions. In the first round, my questions will cover the big picture problems. In the second round, I will ask policy responses to basically address these big picture problems. I suggest panelists to keep their responses under 4 minutes, so we will have time to collect some questions from our audience after the first 2 rounds. There have been already some questions coming. Let me start with Chiara. Chiara, for the book, you produced a very nice chapter on technology diffusion. We see stagnant productivity growth, in fact, weakening productivity growth for an extended period of time around the world. What is the role of technology diffusion in these weak productivity outcomes we have been seeing? Chiara?
Thank you, Jan. Indeed, I mean, the point that we try to make in the book is the fact that technology diffusion can explain the global productivity growth slowdown. And obviously there are specificities, as Chauncey rightly mentioned, for specific countries like Korea. But we believe that technology diffusion, especially diffusion of digital technologies, might not be as homogeneous as one might expect. And indeed, what we find is that technology diffusion, which is a complex process, and it goes from invention, to information about technologies, as Chelsea was mentioning, to decision of adoption and to the effective use of these technologies is very different across different firms, according to whether they're endowed with the skills, with the complementary assets that they need to benefit from these technologies. And indeed, as you mentioned, it might be that the COVID-19 crisis might make a process which normally takes a long time finally speed up. So it gave a push to technology adoption. Now, however, while this might be spurring productivity growth, it might also increase the productivity performance divergence that we are already seeing across firms if what we see is that more tech-savvy firms, for example, are more likely to adopt more technology, more advanced technologies, and if anything, what we would see is that this divergence across firms might actually increase after COVID. So this is, I think, a point that is important to make, that especially in a digital world where most of this development of technology is proprietary, the role of policy to allow, let's say, lagging firms to be able to absorb this knowledge and to access this knowledge is particularly important.
Thank you, Chiara. I'm gonna get back to you on this policy issues. One of the nice things about this book, it just brings this dimension of technological change in financial markets. Thomas Philippon, I think, wrote this wonderful piece, how digital transformation affecting these markets, financial markets. Thomas, obviously, digitalization in financial markets bring huge benefits, but there are some significant risks as well. In your chapter, you discuss these issues. What are the benefits and risks associated with digital innovations and technological transformations we see in financial markets?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. So I think the basic problem comes from what's wrong with finance in the first place. And broadly speaking, you can say finance is too expensive, and that access to good financial services is too unequal. So I think that's the starting point. That is very true around the world. It's very true even in very advanced economy like the US. If you look over a long period of time, the cost of financial services has remained relatively high, definitely higher than you would have hoped, given technological advances. And if you look at access to financial services, you see that it's still very skewed towards upper middle class and rich households, and discrimination is still very prevalent. So that's the starting point. And now comes fintech. And it turns out that I think that there is really a very significant chance that fintech can help a lot in both dimensions. Fintech is already bringing innovation to finance. By doing so, it's putting competitive pressure on incumbents. So in pretty much every market where we saw significant entry by fintech, we saw incumbents react by reducing their fees. And so that means financial services are becoming cheaper thanks to fintech, both because of innovation, which can then be onboarded by big banks, and because of sheer competitive pressure. Another part that I find absolutely fascinating is the impact on discrimination. When I wrote the chapter, there were like maybe 3 or 5 papers that showed that fintech firms do less, engage in less discrimination. There was a very nice piece of research by Ratna Sahay and actually your colleague, Dalia Imef, and co-authors. And since then, I've seen another at least half a dozen papers confirming in many countries, in Africa, in India, in the US, in Brazil, the same thing, which is that algorithms do not discriminate as much as human beings. And so we already see the benefit there of fintech in lowering discrimination across minority groups. So I think that's the big promise. And the big challenge is going to be how do we adapt the regulation in real time so that what is today really a promise of fintech can become can be fulfilled.
Thank you, Thomas. And indeed, we see the reduction in cost, and I'm very happy to hear there's also reduction in discrimination associated the use of fintech when it comes to all types of things, including, of course, the credit applications. Now, let me turn a little bit about these labor market issues and how to make sure firms are able to find a workforce with the necessary human capital compatible with this digital era. Sankun, you have this very nice chapter in the book about how firms need to organize to take advantage of digitalization. And then you are using this Korean data, a very rich data. When we look around, we see that some firms do embrace these technological innovations, quickly adopt them, but some others take a long time to adjust technological changes. My question to you, why do some firms become early adopters of new digital technologies while others wait and see? And what is the role of firms' employment policies in the adoption of new technologies? Sankun.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you for having me today. So as you mentioned, there's a significant heterogeneity in adopting digital technology across firms, and I specifically looked at firms' internal organizational factor that is complementary with the digital technology adoption. So organization and technology complementarity has been studied a lot in the literature. And you may think that digital technology is in large part just an upgraded version of existing IT hardware, software. And in that case, organizational fitness with digital technology would be mostly the same with the fitness with information technology. But I do think digital technology is different from the traditional information technology, especially in business strategy perspective, in the sense that digital technology is mostly used collectively and cross-functionally to provide a new way of solving business problems. Whereas traditional information technology is functional and subordinate to the firm's already chosen business strategy. So, and key here is it is the people who realize that digital technology can provide this kind of new business strategy and new ways of solving business problems. So I focused on how to manage people can be significantly associated with digital technology adoption. And in the chapter, I find that the continuous learning within firm is one of the most significant firm's characteristics that is complementary with digital technology adoption. And surprisingly, I did not find that firms with just more skilled workers necessarily adopted digital technology faster, whereas they tend to adopt information technology. So interpretation for that result is that when technology is just used functionally and independently as the traditional information technology does, the preferred worker skill is just the ability to understand and utilize the existing technology well. But digital technology becomes, as I said, it's different from IT when and only when it is used cross-functionally, collaboratively, and extensively. So good use of digital technologies necessitates workers' creativity, communication skills, and adaptiveness. And I think this requires continuous learning opportunity within firms and may not be simply obtained in the classes at a university or colleges.
Fascinating. I think that kind of the main message is that it's not just a stock of knowledge, it's basically how that knowledge expands, and the continuous learning is critical to basically facilitate adoption of technology, and I find that result quite interesting when I read your piece. I'm going to come back to you about the kind of the policies to foster technological adoption in firms and how that can be done through the kind of the broader labor market educational policy options. But let me turn to Martin. Martin, we covered quite a bit of ground here. We discussed financial market, we discussed the broader technological change and productivity, the technological diffusion, and we also talked about, of course, labor market policies. When we think about advanced economies especially, and already some emerging market economies, there's this challenge of aging. Of course, the aging societies are increasingly more prominent in many countries. Can you tell us your views on the implications of this technological change in the context of aging?
Thank you very much, Ayan, and thanks for inviting me to this fantastic panel. And I have to say that I read the book, and I think it's not just quite impressive, but quite timely. And it's not only timely for the challenges that advanced economies are facing, but also for the challenges that developing and emerging economies are facing. So let me make 2 points. One is the challenges or what does the digital economy means for development strategies, and second, for challenges associated with aging and age societies that, as you said, is not just a problem for advanced economies. So on the first point, on what digital technologies mean for development strategies, I think if we step back, in principle, digital technologies should be a force for good to accelerate growth in developing economies and emerging economies. Let me mention 2 points here. One is it could facilitate leapfrogging, and I think that can be quite beneficial. And 2 areas that we can quickly think of. One is access to finance, and we have seen a lot of examples where significant segments of the population were unfinanced, and with fintech, suddenly they have access to finance. I think that can be incredibly beneficial. The second is information and communication technology, where again, significant segments of the population in developing and emerging markets did not have access to these technologies, and suddenly they have access to cell phones when they didn't have a landphone, okay? A landline. So I think there are these elements that are very important to consider when thinking about the implications of development strategies. But let me add one more. And the other one is, I think digital technologies can lower barriers to trade. And I think that means that both small and medium-sized enterprises and low and emerging economies can, take greater advantage of globalization and integration into the global economy. And I think this is an issue that we shouldn't, or we should consider quite carefully. I'm not going to stop too much on the challenges that developing economies will face, because I think the book covers them very well, and we know that developing economies tended to have much more problems in terms of addressing those structural reforms. But maybe one area that I would like to highlight is that particularly automation and digitalization can render some of the development strategies obsolete. And I think this is a very important point for authorities in developing and emerging economies to consider. The picture I want to a little bit of instill in your mind is that when we started talking about data being the new oil, I think emerging economies and developing economies need to think differently about their development strategies. So that's the first point about the implications of the digital economy for development strategies. The second point is the point you mentioned. Unfortunately, aging and age societies are no longer in the realm of advanced economies, because many economies have become old or are becoming old before they are rich. So then they will have really, really hard challenges ahead and transitional challenges. So to the extent that these digital technologies can can be harnessed by these emerging economies. I think, and to the extent that there's an increase in productivity, which is not a trivial thing, as we just heard from the panelists, and there is an increase in growth and total productivity. The challenges of lower, labor force growth can be managed much better. I think there are also elements where the digital technologies can help maintain living standards. In fact, increase labor force participation because it can complement or help some older people stay in the labor force for longer, and also can transform critical services in healthcare and medicine. So it can be, digital, the digital transformation can be also very, very important for, developing and emerging economies that at fast pace. Last, and since, I work at the IMF, I have to say that it can be quite important in an aging society to make sure that productivity and growth is kept up, because it will facilitate the transitions associated with fiscal and pensions sustainability, which can be really, really large and can be a huge burden to all of these economies. Let me stop here since I was told to be brief, but I'm happy to come back to this point. Thank you.
Well, indeed, Martin, we are discussing these issues. They have huge implications when we think about fiscal policies, when we think about, of course, monetary policies, structural policies down the road, and aging, complicating the challenges associated with all types of changes we see around, but at the same time bringing all types of benefits. So far, we have discussed the big picture problems. I would like now to turn to the importance of policies and how policies can help address some of these problems we have discussed. And I'm going to start with Chiara again. Chiara, you talk about the role of technology diffusion and weakness when we think about productivity. What are the main policies to improve diffusion of productivity across firms, sectors, and countries to promote productivity growth? There is this idea that there's a lot of technological innovation, but we don't see that technological innovation, translating into productivity growth at the aggregate, even though there are some firms, they register very large productivity gains, as you documented in the chapter. Chiara?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is exactly correct. As I said before, most of the productivity advantage of these frontier firms, as we call them, comes very much from these complementary assets that are provided. So there is a first role for policy. If we want to make this productivity growth more inclusive, and as Zia said, the two should go hand in hand, and there isn't really a paradox or an opposition there, is to really make sure that these firms who are more productive, more digital, and that can really benefit, don't entrench themselves at the top. So here, for example, the role for an efficient IT policy, for transparency, a role for when we think about, for example, the new oil, as Martin called it, data transferability, data interoperability, really make sure that there is that competitive environment that Toma was mentioning was so important in the financial sector. This should be the case everywhere. And in the same vein of really making sure that there is a competitive environment place, continue to allow for entrepreneurship and for new potential commerce to really enter the market without facing not only the regulatory barrier, but also barriers that come from being too distant from external. So I would say this, let's make sure that there is no entrenchment at the top, and let's make sure that there is entry, if you want, at the bottom of this movement. So that's the first, I would say, policy. In this big policy toolkit that I mentioned. The second one is one that has been mentioned throughout, I think, from the intervention of KDI president to the last intervention by Martin and Sorun, which is really the role of skills. In a digital, knowledge-intensive economy, as we all face it today, where tacit knowledge is very important, one area where we really need to see lagging firms being reached is skills, not only digital skills, but also all those skills that are very much complementary to digital technologies. This includes, team play, management, information sharing, and so on and so forth. So it's not just the STEM that we all sort of focus on normally. And this is something that is particularly important if we want to make sure that there are no losers and there is a broad-based gain from digital adoption. So skill policies, reallocation of resources as well is one that is very important. And thirdly, as Thomas and Martin mentioned, access to finance, which especially we are in a world where intangible assets are particularly important, but it's still hard to use them as collateral for small enterprises and for startups. So that's where venture capital, different forms of financing are particularly important. And the last, and I would say, not least, the issue is one of openness, as Martin said. These investments to really be rewarding and have significant returns, they need to have scale. If there is no scale, for small firms, it's hard to invest, for example, in a digital change because it requires organizational change in management, and so on. So for this, openness is particularly important, both I think in development and developing economy, and that's where policy, with industrial policy, trade policy, can really make a difference. I'll stop here because I've gone through my 4 minutes, but I think there is a big toolkit, what I would like to say, and this is just, I would say, the point of the iceberg. The surface will go on for a while on this.
Thank you, Chiara. You really laid the ground, basically headline all the big, I think, policy interventions necessary in different realms. I'm going to turn to Thomas immediately. Thomas, you talked about benefits and risks associated with fintech. How can policymakers improve the benefits of fintech while minimizing the risks associated with it?
Yeah, so I think first we need to think about what's special in finance. So, if you think about fintech as innovative firms, disruptive firms, then the definition of an innovative firm is that it does not play by the old rules. And that's a definition of disruption. But that could mean two different things, depending on which rules you're talking about. It could be a technological rule, so they come up with better product quality or better ways or cheaper way to do stuff. Or it could mean regulations. So in one case, we would say that's technological innovation. In another case, we would say it's regulatory arbitrage. Now, so this tension between, true innovation and regulatory arbitrage, to be clear, is true in every industry. Right? If you look at, take something everybody knows like Airbnb or Uber, where are they successful? Well, it's a mixture of arbitrage and true innovation. So then you would say, well, then nothing is special in finance. But that's not quite right, because finance has one particular feature, which is the regulations are particularly heavy, which means that, I would argue some of the time for good reasons, some of the time for bad reasons. But that's beside the point. Whatever the reason is, the regulations are heavy in finance. So what that means is that the relative balance is shifted towards regulatory arbitrage. Because it's very regulated, there's a small scope for regulatory arbitrage. So I think the first thing to recognize is that the one challenge is to avoid regulatory arbitrage in finance. Now, how do we do that without killing innovation? So I think the obvious strategy that's been used first in the UK, but then everybody realized it was a good idea, so people started doing the same, is the sandboxing. So sandboxing, I don't know, people who don't know, like playing in the sandbox like little kids. That means you let firms play in the sandbox without too many rules, so that they can grow. And then when they graduate to being larger firms, then we start imposing the same rules or tighter rules. Okay, so that is clearly the good way to do it. I think there's a lot of learning by doing in that world, and the tricky issue a little bit is how do you define exit from the sandbox? When is a firm big enough that you want to impose on the firm all the burdens of existing regulations? Okay, so I think that's kind of point number one. I think we know more or less the strategy, which is adapted sandboxing. The details are going to be tricky, and I think that but I'm relatively optimistic because I think countries, the UK took the lead. I think people have learned from what they've done. I think there is kind of a framework there that has a chance of working. The second big issue is the one that's very connected to what Chiara just said, which is one danger of digital innovation in finance, just like in many other sectors, is the fact that many of the return to scale in finance happen at the firm level. Okay, so that's how they manage to give product for very cheap to everybody, which, by the way, is one of the reasons that democratization is good and is improving. It's because once Vanguard figured out the way to do robo-advising, they do it because they want to do it for their big clients, not because they want to do it for the relatively poor people. But once they've done it, they can provide the same service, essentially zero marginal cost to poor people. Okay, so that's the great part. Now, of course, the flip side of it is that because of the nature of these fixed costs, that tends to lead to a relatively high concentration on the supply side. Okay, like the firms in digital, because of this effect, tend to be relatively large. So the key issue then is to avoid excessive concentration in finance. There are many tools to do that. Some are common to other industries, so I won't mention them. The one that's specific to finance is the data part. So it's not a cure for all, but I think that one thing policymakers need to do is to be a bit proactive and forward-thinking with respect to data. So we know that the solution is going to look something like rules on data sharing and data ownership together with APIs, because the key thing is you want to kind of embed in your regulation the fact that once you're big and successful and you have a lot of data, you need to have APIs that are accessible. So APIs are like the interface, if you want, for other firms to access data from your system. And they have to be secure and everything. But that's the way to then allow entry by other firms, okay? So that you cannot just close your data and so I think the key there in finance is that the intersection of data ownership and APIs. So that's point number two. And point number three, I think, is the issue with algorithms and fraud. So the regulation of algorithms is different from the regulation of human beings. In the case of actors who are kind of mostly benevolent, I don't think it's actually that tricky, because if you think about the fundamentals of regulation, there's no reason to think it's harder to regulate an algorithm than a person, and many reasons to think it's actually easier. The one place where it's tricky, though, is that algorithms are becoming very, very smart, and they are becoming very smart at exploiting behavioral biases in human beings. Okay? Now, to be fair, though, humans, we are very good at doing it to themselves. So we have like 30 years of research showing